right, today we're jumping into a really big one. We're going back to 2001 to a landmark study out of Sydney, Australia that really tried to put an end to one of the biggest, most heated medical debates of the 20th century.
And it all boiled down to this one simple question. Do silicone implants cause autoimmune disease? I mean, for decades, this question fueled so much public debate, a lot of fear, and just a mountain of scientific research trying to figure it out.
And this wasn't just some stuffy academic debate. Not at all. This was all over the headlines. It was in the courts with these huge, high-stakes lawsuits. It was all centered on these claims of a brand new illness. Some people were even calling it siliconosis. So with all that noise and speculation swirling around, this team of researchers in Sydney decided, okay, we need a real answer. They designed this absolutely massive, long-term study to try and cut through it all. So, let's break down what they did and what they actually found.
Okay, let's get right into it. Now, to really get why this particular study was such a game changer, we kind of have to rewind a bit and see how this whole controversy even got started in the first place.
So the story really kicks off way back in 1964. You have these first case reports coming out of Japan, and they coined this term human adjuvant disease. Then through the 70s and 80s, you just get more and more of these anecdotal stories, right? Individual cases linking implants to things like scleroderma and lupus. By the time the 90s roll around, scientists are trying to get a handle on it with bigger studies, but they get a lot of criticism. People say they're not big enough, or they don't follow patients for long enough, or the methods just aren't solid. And that is what set the stage for this massive effort in Sydney in 2001. So the big question is, what made the Sydney study different? How did they plan to fix the problems that other studies had and hopefully get a much clearer answer?
Well, the secret sauce was really in its design. It was built on this really clever comparison. The researchers found one group of women who, got silicone implants for cosmetic reasons. But then, and this is the smart part, they found a second group, a control group of women who had other kinds of plastic surgery, things like a nose job or a tummy tuck, surgeries that didn't involve any silicone at all.
And their process was incredibly rigorous. I mean, they found almost 1,200 women in total. Then they painstakingly matched the two groups on all these key things, like their age, the year they had the surgery, and even the surgeon who did it. The goal was to make the comparison as fair as humanly possible. Then, and this is so important, they followed these women for on average 15 years. 15! Just tracking their health, looking for any differences in diseases, in symptoms, in their blood work, the whole shebang.
Okay, so after all that matching, all that tracking over a decade and a half, what was the big takeaway? What did they find?
The main result was incredibly clear for all those major connective tissue diseases that everyone was so worried about. We're talking scleroderma, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, you name it. The study found no link. Zero. No statistically significant connection to silicone implants. So to put it simply, the main conclusion from this enormous 15-year project was, well, it was reassuring. When it came to the biggest, scariest question of all, the data gave a pretty clear answer. No.
But you know how it goes with science, right? It's almost never that simple. The main finding was clear, for sure. But when the researchers started digging a little deeper into the data, looking at the clinical exams and the blood tests, they found a couple of things they weren't really expecting.
Okay, so here's the first surprise. They found that women with implants had a much higher rate of something called axillary adenopathy. That's just the fancy medical term for swollen lymph nodes right under your arm. And look at the numbers. Almost 17% of the women with implants had this, compared to under 5% in the control group. That's a big difference. Just to put a number on that, the odds of a woman having these swollen lymph nodes were 3.5 times higher if she had implants. So this wasn't some tiny little blip or a random fluke. This was a real, statistically significant finding, and it definitely needed some explaining.
All right, the second unexpected finding came from the blood tests. It turns out the group with implants had more people with a low-level positive result for something called anti-nuclear antibodies, or ANA for short. Now, these are basically markers that your immune system is activated, and they can sometimes be a sign of autoimmune activity. Okay, So now things are getting a little more complicated, right? On one hand, you have no link to the big, scary diseases. But on the other hand, you have these two signals that definitely popped up, the swollen lymph nodes and these low-level immune markers. So, what did the researchers think was going on? Well, for the swollen lymph nodes, their theory was pretty straightforward. They figured it was probably just the body's local immune system doing its job, reacting to a foreign object, which in this case was the implant. It's kind of like how your body reacts to a splinter, you know? It's a localized thing, not a sign that your whole body is sick. The ANA finding, though, that's a bit more nuanced. Think of an ANA test like an alarm for your immune system. But what's super important is the volume of that alarm. It's called the titer. A really faint, low-level alarm is a totally different story than a loud, blaring, high-level one. And that difference turned out to be everything. Because what the study found was that while that low-level alarm was more common in the implant group, the rates of the high-level alarm, the one that's really tied to actual diseases, were exactly the same in both groups. That's why the authors themselves said this finding was, and I'm quoting here, of dubious clinical significance. Basically, they thought it probably didn't mean much in the real world.
But wait, there's one more little twist to this story. In a final analysis they did after the fact, the researchers noticed a statistical clue, something that connected their findings in a way they really didn't expect.
So they went back and looked only at the women in the implant group who had those swollen lymph nodes, and they found that this specific little subgroup was about 3.2 times more likely to later report symptoms of something called Raynaud's phenomenon. That's a circulation problem. It can make your fingers and toes go all white and numb when it's cold. But, and this is a huge but, the authors themselves immediately put up a big warning sign about this. They were very clear that this was a post hoc analysis. That just means they didn't plan to look for this from the beginning. It's a pattern they found after they'd already collected all the data. And they warned everyone to view it with due caution. Why? Because if you torture data long enough, it'll confess to anything. You can find random patterns just by chance if you keep slicing it up in new ways.
So what we're left with is this really intriguing clue. It's something that makes you go, and maybe suggest an idea for a future study. But it is absolutely not proof that one causes the other. It's a question mark, not an exclamation point. And that really is where this incredible study leaves us. On one hand, it gave us some really strong, reassuring answers about the biggest fears people had. But it also did what great science always does, right? It answered one huge question, but uncovered these other, smaller, more complicated puzzles that we're still trying to figure out today. And it leaves us with a really important question for how we think about science. When you get a big study that gives you a loud, clear no on the main question, how much weight do you give to the little whispers you find in the data?